Today we're going to continue in the story of Paul's life, and we've been going through the book of Acts, and Paul is now just finishing his third missionary journey, and we heard last week how God called him to go back to Jerusalem. And even as God called him to go back to Jerusalem, he was given warnings. Don't go. Bad things are going to happen in Jerusalem. And there was these prophetic voices that told him about what was to come. And yet there was this strong determination in Paul to continue forward on the mission that God had set him out for. And Paul knew that God had called him to this, even to the point of death. And so this week we're going to start to see a little bit of some of the circumstances that Paul now goes through. And we're going to see over the next few weeks and months that Paul, hopefully we'll be done in a few months, but we'll see. We'll see that Paul actually goes through some pretty extreme circumstances to get to the place where God eventually ordains him to be in Rome. And so, we see how all of these different things, but Paul was so sure that God had called him to this purpose. Let's read in Acts 21. We'll start in verse 15. And it says this: after we packed our things and left for Jerusalem, some believers from Caesarea accompanied us, and they took us home to the home of Mason, a man normally from Cyprus and one of the early believers. And when we arrived, the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to meet with James, and all the elders of Jerusalem, of the church, were present. After greeting them, Paul gave a detailed account of the things God had accomplished among the Gentiles through his ministry. After hearing this, they praised God, and then they said, "You know, dear brothers, how many thousands of Jews have also believed, and they all follow the law of Moses very seriously. But the Jewish believers here in Jerusalem have been told that you are teaching all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn their backs on the laws of Moses. They've heard that you teach them not to circumcise their children or follow other Jewish customs. What should we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. Here's what we want you to do. We have 4 men here who have completed their vow. Go with them to the temple and join them in the purification ceremony, praying for them to have their heads ritually shaved. Then everyone will know that the rumors are all false and that you yourself observe the Jewish laws. As for the Gentile believers, they should do what we already told them in a letter. They should abstain from eating food offered to idols, from consuming blood, or the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." So Paul went to the temple the next day with the other men. They had already started the purification ritual. So he publicly announced the date when their vows would end and the sacrifices would be offered for each of them. The 7 days were almost ended when some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple and roused a mob against him. They grabbed him, yelling, "Men of Israel, help us! This is the man who preaches against our people everywhere and tells everybody to disobey the Jewish laws. He speaks against the temple and even defiles the holy place by bringing in Gentiles." For earlier that day they had seen him in the city with Trophimus, a Gentile from Ephesus, and they assumed Paul had taken him to the temple. The whole city was rocked by these accusations, and a great riot followed. Paul was grabbed and dragged out of the temple, and immediately the gates were closed behind him, and they were trying to kill him. And word reached the commander of the Roman regiment that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately called out his soldiers and officers and ran down among the crowd, and when mobs saw the commander and the troops coming, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander arrested him and ordered him bound with 2 chains, and he asked the crowd who he was and what he had done. Some shouted one thing, some another, and since he couldn't find out the truth in all the uproar and confusion, he ordered that Paul be taken to the fortress. As Paul reached the stairs, the mob grew so violent, the soldiers had to lift him to their shoulders to protect him. And the crowd followed behind, shouting, "Kill him! Kill him!" interesting story we have here. Interesting kind of place of events, and Paul now is going and he's finally facing the repercussions of the call that he has come. And so today what I want to say is that in our lives, when we are called into the call of God, when he takes us to where he is calling us, there will be seasons where there will be attack. And there will be seasons where we come under persecution. You know, in the North American church, we don't like to talk about persecution. And really, in reality, I don't think any one of us has ever truly experienced persecution. But it's interesting, when I was at the Alliance conference last week, one of the things that was interesting is we had a lot of our missionaries that were there, and if any of them had a red tag on them, it was very intentional, because that red tag basically meant, number one, that their names that are on that tag are not real names, and number two, don't take a picture of them because they are serving in a closed access country. And so it was interesting to hear how these individuals are going out on the mission field. They want to take the gospel of Jesus to these areas that are closed, where Christianity is not allowed. And I was able to sit down with one lady who literally was beaten and kicked out of the country where she was serving when they found out she was a Christian. And yet she went back to an adjacent country and began to serve and began to send missionaries back into the country where she was serving. And just the heart that she had for missions and ministry. And sometimes I think we live in our comfortable little church, we live in our comfortable little community, and we live the life that God has called us, and we live pretty comfortable lives. And yet what we see here is that often there's many different things that will come, and there will be persecutions in our life when we follow the call that God has for us. But the interesting thing here is the enemy used false accusations. And I think we can apply this even into our own lives, that often there will be seasons in our life that as we follow the call of God on our lives, the enemy will bring accusations against us, either within our own mind, within our own heart, with our own endeavors, or from other people on the outside that would come to accuse us and would try to stop us from the will of God in our lives. You can't do this. You don't have the ability. You're not able. And that those lies of the enemy will come and they'll start to speak into us and try and stop us from the work that God has for us. And here we have Paul, who's being faithful. He's doing what God's calling him, and yet people are coming and they're accusing him and speaking to us. Now, I don't know about you, but I know when someone makes a false accusation against me, the very first thing I want to do is defend myself. That's not true. That's not what happened. That's not the case. And yet Paul never at one point in this begins to defend himself. And I think we can kind of take what Jesus said, that when we follow Christ, there will be accusations against us. Matthew 5:11 says this, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." See, Jesus told his disciples that it would happen, and they should embrace it. They should take it and say, great, this is a good sign. People are accusing me. People are coming against me. That means I am in the will of God. Wow, that's a little bit scary, hey? But it shows that there's this idea that when we are living out the calling that God has on our lives, the enemy is going to do everything he can to stop us. And sometimes that's in our own minds. Sometimes it's in our own thought life. Sometimes we begin to bring false accusations against ourselves. We begin to look at ourselves less than who God has created us to be. We don't see the giftings and the abilities he's put into our own lives. And what we need to start to do is say, no, if I am feeling these things, if I am feeling these attacks on my life, if I am hearing those thoughts, that means God is calling me to something bigger than I can even imagine. You know, Paul gives wise counsel to Titus in Titus 2:7 and 8. He says, "In everything set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech, so that they cannot condemn you, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. He's basically saying, live your life with such integrity, with such a way that even if people do come and accuse you, you can stand strong, knowing assuredly in your heart that you have lived out a life of integrity, that you've lived a life fully for what God has for you. But ultimately, we need to be aware that the enemy of our souls will stir up things to bring discomfort. The enemy will come and he will try and cause discomfort in our hearts, discomfort in our minds, discomfort in our spirits, and he will use people. He will use people who we love. He will use people who we maybe don't love that much, but they will come and they will cause problems within our lives because the enemy wants to attack us. He wants to stop us from the destiny that God has for our lives. And yet Matthew 5:44 says this, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Whew, that's a hard one. You know, maybe there's somebody even in your life who has attacked you recently. And maybe there's been some circumstances where they've accused you, where they've said things against you. And today the Lord is saying to you, bless them. That's pretty hard to do at times. Bless them. Romans 12:14 says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Oh, I don't like that one. There's times I feel like this need to just say something about other people, or in my mind I judge them and I'm just like, but God wants us to bless. The second thing we can learn from this passage is that the enemy's goal is to destroy us. I wish that I could say that the enemy isn't at work, but one of the things that I know for sure is that the enemy is working constantly. And he is trying to attack each one of our lives in different ways. And his path and his endeavor to come and bring destruction in our life is different and unique to each one of us. But the enemy is at work. In this situation, the enemy wants to create havoc. And he rouses. It says the whole city was aroused. It was like, do you remember the Vancouver riots when they didn't win the cup and just the craziness that went on? Well, that's like what happened here. In all of Jerusalem, there's like this riot, and everybody's rising up, and they want to kill this one person, Paul. And they want to take him out, and they want to be able to come against him. And Jesus revealed Satan's agenda to his disciples. He says this in John 10:10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I have come that they may have life, and to the fullest. You know, I'm fairly certain each one of us has felt the result of the enemy's attacks on our lives. We may have felt it in our own temptations. We may have felt it in our own struggles, in our own will, in our own abilities. I think each one of us has at times, and we probably go through seasons where we feel like we're super victorious, and then we hit a season where we just feel like the enemy is just attacking us, like there's just this constant attack of the enemy on our lives. And what I'll say to you is this: when the enemy is attacking, it's likely because God is wanting to do something big in and through you. The enemy wants to stop you. He wants to stop you from God's plan for your life. And that is exactly what the enemy is doing. The enemy wanted to kill Paul. He didn't want him to get to Rome. He didn't want him to finish the ministry that God had for his life. He wanted to finish him in Jerusalem. And yet, that brings me to my next point, is that God will come to our rescue. God will come to our rescue. Verse 32 says this, and he at once took some of the officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. Now, these weren't operatives of God. These weren't people that were Christians. This was army men that just said, there's a complete chaos. We got to go fix it. And so they come running, these soldiers come running to Paul's, to arrest Paul, but basically they protected his life, because here you have this crowd that are out there just beating the tar out of Paul, and these soldiers come in and they say, we'll arrest him, we'll take him into custody, he's now ours, don't hurt him anymore. And so then they start to take him, and the people are so crazy that the soldiers literally have to lift Paul, because the people are trying to beat him as they're taking them back to a place of safety. Like, can you imagine the chaos that's going on in this moment? And while I'll say this, physical safety is not always the first concern of God. It's planned for us. He will come to our rescue in those times of need. There was countless times that the apostles received, they were in certain death sentences and danger, and God protected them. I will say, though, that every one of the apostles died for the cause of Christ, except for one. There was one who did not. But every other one of them died in the call of God that was on their lives. And yet I believe here we can understand that God is on our side. He is with us, and they were confident to go forward in the missions journey that he had for them. You know, remember Jesus said, but take heart and have courage, because I have overcome the world. You know, if you believe the Bible, there's no question that God can do anything. And I believe he can, and he does. I believe in supernatural miracles. I believe that God is constantly working, and he comes in the midst of our lives. And I believe that what the enemy tries to do will try to stop us, but God will come and make a way in the midst of those circumstances. And so what I would say is this, is that he might not always remove us completely from the danger or from what we're facing, but he always will be with us, no matter the storm that we are facing. Paul still has a pretty big journey to go on here, so there's going to be some pretty big ups and downs, and there's going to be some pretty big miraculous things that take place before Paul actually gets to where God's taking him. And yet in the midst of it all, God's hand was on his life. As his children, it's okay for us to ask for protection for ourselves, for our loved ones. And we can expect that God will come and rescue us. But we also have to learn that at the end of the day, there is a submission to God's will. Jesus even himself said, not my will, but your will be done, Father. And saying, God, I trust you, no matter the circumstances that I'm going through, no matter the pain that I'm facing, I trust you for who you are. That leads me to my fourth and final point. No matter what, God will accomplish his purpose through our lives. Do you want to think about this in this sense, that everything that you have had in your life was to bring you to the point that you are today, so that God could continue to accomplish his purpose in your life moving forward? See, sometimes we look back on life and we look at the hiccups, we look at our failures, we look at all of the different things, and yet no matter what the enemy had tried to do through all of those seasons, through all of those things, they were just preparation. And as the enemy would attack, and he would bring struggle, and he'd bring toil, and he'd bring problems within our life, he'd bring heartache, God was saying, despite what the enemy is doing, I am working in and through you. I have a plan and a destiny and a purpose for your life. And even now, wherever you're at in your life, God is saying, I am still working in and through you. Now, it's interesting, next week when Stacy preaches, you're going to hear that Paul gets up and he begins to preach a message. He just got beaten to the pulp of these guys. And yet he's like, hey guys, before we go inside, can I just share a quick word of encouragement to these people? I think Paul's sometimes a sucker for punishment. I don't know, but I really wish I had the cojones that he had. I just wish that I had a little bit more of that gusto that he had. Because he gets up and he just begins to preach the gospel. And there is this deep understanding that God is at work. And what I take just such hope in this is that no matter what, God is working in and through you and I today. He's working in our lives, and he's creating opportunities, like the story that Tracy shared about being able to just have a time of sharing with somebody about the hope of Jesus. To me, that just excites me. It excited me to hear from Garrett this week and just hear about how 3 of his friends are all of a sudden actively saying, we want to go to church. We want to seek God. We want to do these things. And so they're going to church together and they're finding life together. And to me, that's wow, look at the hand of God in the midst of these circumstances. And despite everything that happened, God is at work. And his hand is intricately working within our lives. So I would encourage you today. You might be in a struggle, you might be in a toil, but I also want you to reflect on, what is God doing in and through me? What is God building in my life? How is God using me in what he wants to do? So, I think we'll leave it right there. But what I will say is this: God has called us each on an amazing mission to partner with him in bringing the gospel of Jesus to others around us. Let's just pray. Jesus, I just thank you that no work of the enemy is stronger than the work that you have in our lives. And no matter the accusations that come against us, no matter the toils that we face, no matter the struggles that we encounter, in the midst of it all, you are doing your good work within our hearts, our minds, and our spirit. And I just pray that there would be a new spirit of just moving forward, of trusting you, of knowing that your hand is on our lives. I bless each person that they would go out and do the work of Jesus this week, that they would bless the people around them, they'd bless their families, they'd bless their neighbors, they would show the love of Jesus, they would speak when it's time to speak, they would have boldness like Paul, and Jesus, that your hand would rest on them in a powerful way. In Jesus' name, amen.